thank you all for coming tonight. It is a great privilege to welcome you to this book launch tonight. At least it is tonight in Australia, but I know that there are people joining us from about 25 different countries. So thank you so much for coming. My name is Chris Mulheron, and I'm the Executive Director of ISCAST, an Australian not-for-profit, which is also known as Christians in Science and Technology. As you know, ISCAST is privileged to be the publisher of The Forest Underground, Hope for a Planet in Crisis. We are so pleased to publish Tony's story because the book is written in the spirit of the ISCAST vision. ISCAST is committed to both mainstream science and to the historic Christian faith. And from a Christian perspective, we take very seriously the mandate of the Creator to care for the creation. Tony Rinaudo, scientist, practitioner, Christian, and carer of the planet, exemplifies such a vision. Tonight, we will hear Tony speak more about his journey of science and faith. And we'll also hear from a celebrated filmmaker, Volker Schlöndorff. Afterwards, there will be time for a few questions to Tony. Please use the chat box to post your questions at any time. Finally, please do leave your cameras on if possible, and perhaps even add your country to your name so that we can enjoy the global audience. Welcome to everyone. Now, before I introduce Volker, let me remind us that as we meet together in many parts of the world to think about restoration of the land, it's appropriate to acknowledge that all land has a history which is often rooted in injustices. So tonight, we acknowledge the Indigenous caretakers of the planet, who in many places have been displaced or in other ways treated unjustly. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Volker Schlöndorff, who is joining us from Munich, Germany. Volker is a dear friend of Tony and an Oscar award-winning German filmmaker, most well known for his film, The Tin Drum, which earned Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards in 1980. He has worked in many places, including Germany, France, and the United States. Volker has recently released his documentary called The Forest Maker, which is centered around Tony's work. The film is currently touring around cinemas in Europe, spreading great enthusiasm about farmer-managed natural regeneration. I think Volker mentioned that 25,000 German people have seen the film recently. We're anticipating that the film will be released in Australia next year. Having travelled to Niger with Tony and having witnessed the potential of FMNR, Volker was invited to write the foreword to Tony's book. We're very grateful that Volker could join us today to address us on this momentous occasion. Welcome, Volker. Please.
Thank you for having me. Well, you say Tony's dear friend. Yes, indeed. But 3 years ago, I didn't know him. I was invited by World Vision Germany, where I'm engaged for about 12 years or so, for an informal dinner with some alternate Nobel Award Prize winner on his way from Stockholm home to Australia, making a pit stop in Berlin. And so we found ourselves in the back room of an Italian restaurant, and Tony gave an indeed informal but very convincing speech. I was so struck by his personality, but mostly also by FMNR, by the very simple, obvious, and understandable solution to instead of planting, to start from the roots when it goes about growing trees. So I went to see him afterwards, and I said, but this is such a groundbreaking work you're doing, and you're doing it for 30 years already. I only learned about it today. I think you must have thousands of disciples who go about the world to spread your message. And he said, yeah, well, it's indeed in about 26 African countries now it's practiced and elsewhere. But as far as disciples, no, I mostly work alone. I said, but that's impossible. You must be better known. Would you like me to make a movie about you? That just, you know, in the moment, I've never made a documentary. I'm a fiction filmmaker. I've worked with Dustin Hoffman, Richard Widmark, whom not. But there I was. Next morning, we met, took a piece of paper, made a deal between us in 10 lines. And 6 months later, I was in Bamako, Mali, to see what Tony was doing. And fortunately, I had brought a little camera with me. Looks like a photo camera, but that's actually what a digital camera looks like today. I hired a local cameraman and a local sound man, and such with 3 people. I followed Tony on this first trip through Mali, Ghana, very interesting country, and then the Niger, where he had started everything. 8 months later, we were together in India, and so on and so on. And I finished last year, April, exactly a year ago, in Ethiopia. So I spent the last 3 years of my life with FMNR and with Tony, and never got bored a minute. Actually, I think it changed me enormously. It turned me from a skeptical into an optimist. And when I used to be the incredible one, the non-believer in whatever progress in Africa, and well, Tony told me better. And today, when I see him on screen in the cinemas, and I do the Q&As with the audience, it is obvious. It is not the ideas, the discovery of the FMNR and of the root system underneath alone. It is really Tony's wonderful personality, the way he communicates with the farmers and the farmer women and the children in whatever country, whether in any one of the African countries or in India, it is always the same. He meets people at eye level. He is like immediately with them. Even though when he started in the 80s, they called him the crazy white farmer, at least that's what he says. I don't even know I can believe that, because today they consider him as one of us. He is, some told me when I asked them, but what about this white man? And they say, what white man? I don't see a white face here. Tony is one of us. And he is an expert, and we need these experts. That I just, as a note to those woke people who think they don't need old white men in Africa or elsewhere anymore. No, expertise and humility and communication is always welcome everywhere. And Tony is the best example, how to speak to people, how to listen to them, how to find cunning answers, but without ever patronizing and without ever giving an inch up of his belief and what he thinks should be done. I just tell one example from the film to give you his spirit. We were sitting under a roof thatch with young and old people in a village in the Republic of Niger, and one of the women, and there were like hundreds of children around everywhere, and like always in Africa. And this farmer women who knew him for decades said, yes, Tony, but you know, the world is changing. There is more and more people, but the land doesn't augment. What should we do? And Tony was laughing and says, yeah, why she's challenging me? What are you looking around? What do you all think here, addressing the men? What do you think we should do? And, you know, everybody knew the problem, which is the overpopulation, but nobody dares to address this cause. So Tony then said, maybe we should prohibit marriage. A way of speaking family planning. And of course, it broke a big laughter, the whole crowd. This is his person indeed is making the difference. It's not just the theory and the discovery of the roots, it is really his persona. And so in his book, it is wonderful to see him share, you know, basically his life story. It's a very optimistic book, even though it tells a lot of sad stories.
Thank you, Volker. Thank you very much for a personal introduction to Tony and your story. And on behalf of ISCAST publishing the book, what a great job you're doing publicizing Tony's story. It's just great, and I look forward to seeing the feature film, the long documentary when it comes out in Australia. Well, it's time to hear from Tony. I don't really need to introduce Tony. He probably needs very little introduction to most of our audience tonight, and Volker has already introduced him in a way. My own contact with Tony goes back some 40 years to a church in Melbourne, where I recall Tony and Liz as a young couple leaving their home to move to Niger, where they would be involved as missionary agronomists. Fast forward 40 years, and Tony is known globally as the forest maker, after leading people to regenerate millions of hectares of dry land. FMNR, as it's now called, Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, has blossomed, offering hope and improved livelihoods to many people. And now, following the subtitle of the book, FMNR offers hope for a planet in environmental crisis. Tony's an extraordinary person, combining a deep humility with a stubborn resoluteness that pushes through the obstacles in order to do what is right and good. He's won many prizes and awards, including the prestigious Right Livelihood Award. But that's enough from me. Let me hand over to Tony to speak to us. Tony, let me ask you one question before we give you free rein to speak to us. Why did you ask ISCAST to publish your book? We are not a big publisher. You might have gone to one of the big global publishers. Why did you ask ISCAST to publish your book?
Thanks, Chris, and hello everybody. Publishing with ISCAST gave me the opportunity to share in a natural way, a non-preachy way, how faith has been a driving force in my life. And it's enabled me to describe through story that the lines drawn between science and faith are really quite artificial. Good, I think we're there. Can everybody see that pen and paper?
That's great.
So I just want to thank everyone for joining us. It's evening here, but some of you it's morning and middle of the day. For me, it's a real celebration, and welcome to our party. I learned just the other day that the books, the first print run, will arrive at the publisher here in Melbourne on Monday. And for me, the writing process started nearly 2.5 years ago. So it's been a very long gestation and finally arrived. So it's a celebration for me. Over the years, a number of people said to me, Tony, why don't you write a book? And I really just brushed it off. I thought, they've got to be joking. I don't have enough story to fill a whole book. But a few years ago, and I guess age counts for something, I started to reflect. And I thought, when I lived in Niger, I had that hands-on opportunity to engage with people. And then that time passed. I moved back to Australia and I had a more supervisory role. and managing projects in different countries. And then that time passed and I moved into a more advisory and spokesperson type of role. And then after I hit 60, I thought, what's the best use of my time in this phase of my life? And I thought about it. I thought, really, I could make a difference more by inspiring the next generation. And so I started writing, and then COVID hit. We had lockdowns. It stopped me from traveling, and I really had no excuse. So here we are, 2.5 years later, we have a book. I'll just try and work how to steer this thing. So I grew up in a very beautiful part of Australia, northeast Victoria, and I swam and fished in those rivers. I walked over some of those hills and climbed some of the trees. I think I must have been a bit of a dreamer. Every Sunday after church, and we'd have the dinner, we'd get in the car. Mum and Dad would put us in the car and we'd head off towards Wangaratta, a nearby city, to visit my grandparents. And you'd be driving through fairly heavily forested hills until you got to the Beechworth turnoff. And you come up to this rise and then start to go down into the valley, and the country opens up, and bang, that bald hill hits you in the eyes. And I'd be dreaming there. I'll just read the little passage. Once past the Beechworth turnoff, the country opened up and the broader plain was framed by the treeless Mamungi hills. Can hills speak? Maybe not in words, yet in their nakedness, they seem to be grieving and crying out for help and restoration. As we drove to Wangaratta each Sunday, in my mind's eye, I was on those hills, toiling in my gumboots, shovel in hand, planting trees and plugging the deeply eroded gullies. Sometimes we returned home in the dark. At sections of the Great Alpine Road, the branches of the huge gum trees on either side of the road met above us. As the car sped through the night, the headlights illuminated the trunks and branches. An enchanted cave appeared in front of us and disappeared into the darkness behind us. Not satisfied with these short tunnels, I mentally filled the gaps by planting the missing trees. So I think I was quite a dreamer, but at that stage of my life, there are probably 3 significant things that impacted me, shaped the person that I am, and the type of work that I do until this day. And so the first one, that bush then that I loved, was being destroyed. The hills were being cleared and left fallow for years on end. They were growing tobacco in the fertile valleys, and the pesticides from spraying would drift into the rivers where we swam and drank from, killing the fish. At the same time, I would watch the news and read articles in the papers. While we were growing tobacco in our valley, children just like me, who through no fault of their own, happened to be born somewhere else, were going to bed hungry. And the injustice of it made me very angry. I felt quite cross, but frustrated. The third thing that shaped me, I think, was my mother's faith. And it taught me that there was much more to life than money or security, that we do have an obligation to care for those less fortunate than ourselves, and we have an obligation to care for creation. So I did the only thing that I felt I could do at that stage. I just shot up a child's prayer. Please, God, use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. And I've tried to be true to that all of my life. I went to university to study agriculture, and I thought, no girl's going to be mad enough to want to marry me and live in a mud hut in the middle of Africa. Well, fortunately, I was wrong. There was at least one, and Liz has been by my side ever since, a constant support and companion. And in her own right, even though she doesn't get the recognition that I do, in her own right, made significant contributions to the work that I'll talk about tonight. we graduated and were accepted by a mission organization serving in mission, and we were assigned to a place in Maradi, in Niger Republic, West Africa, called Maradi. Niger is a borderland of the Sahara Desert, and the landscape that confronted us when we landed there, I was a bit shocked, I think, fresh graduate from university. What on earth have I gotten into here? It was a landscape on the point of ecological collapse, one which was barely able to support life on Earth. And the consequences of severe clearing of the land, and in combination with climate change, we weren't so aware of that at that time, but in hindsight, we know that the average rainfall has dropped by 25 to 30%. So that deforestation and climate change were devastating. The frequency and severity of drought was increasing. Wind speeds at ground level could exceed 60 kilometers per hour, sandblasting the crops as they emerged and sometimes burying them completely. Soil surface temperatures could exceed 70 degrees Celsius. And then even in the years when it did rain, you could have an outbreak of insect pests that totally devastated the crop. In my mind, if one of the root causes of these problems was deforestation, then presto, all we have to do is get trees back in there. And I gave it all that I had. I consulted the experts, I read widely, I experimented with different methods. We used exotic species, indigenous species, you name it, we tried it. Nothing worked in a sustainable, cost-effective, or viable way. And I think after 2.5 years, and I'll read the passage. After 2.5 years of mounting frustration, I felt like a failure and was ready to give up and go home. But deep down, I knew that I was meant to be there and had to keep trying again. I reached out for help. I asked God to forgive us for destroying the gift of his beautiful creation. While at the time I did not think that I had directly contributed to deforestation in the Sahel, my Western lifestyle, which involved rapacious overconsumption and waste of natural resources, pollution and destruction of habitats, had contributed to a global problem. Because of this destruction, people were suffering. They were hungry, impoverished, and fearful of the future. I asked God to open my eyes and show me what to do. And so at that point, it would have been very, very easy to give up and come back home. Now, I'd been on this track almost weekly for 2.5 years by this time. And on this particular day, actually delivering a truck and trailer load of tree seedlings, knowing full well that probably 80% of those seedlings would die. And Volker, it's true, they did call me the crazy white farmer. And if you put yourself in their shoes, struggling to grow enough food, struggling to get money, of course I was crazy. Who in their right mind would put trees on their valuable farmland? So I did seem a bit crazy to them. But on this particular day, and I'm letting the air pressure out of the tires so that we don't get bogged in the sandy soil, and looking over the landscape, north, south, east, west, almost treeless plain. I thought, hopeless, total waste of money and time, better to give up and go home. But again, I shot up a prayer, please God help us, open our eyes. And on this particular day, this useless looking bush, it could have been an agricultural weed for all I knew, this bush caught my eye. And walking over to take a closer look, immediately when you see the shape of a leaf, it's like a signature. It tells you what the species is. This isn't a bush, this isn't a weed, it's a tree. And it's been cut down and it's re-sprouting. It's trying to get back up to tree height again, but people never let it. They cut it, they plow over it, they graze it, they never give it the chance. But in that moment, for me, everything changed. And that was the answer to my prayer. The battle lines shifted. I was no longer fighting the Sahara Desert. I didn't need a miracle species of tree that could withstand heat and goats and people pulling them out. everything that you needed for reforestation was literally at your feet. And the real battle now was over false beliefs and negative attitudes about trees and nature and destructive practices. And I realized that if I could convince people, farmers, parents, communities, if I could convince them to work with nature instead of continuously fighting against it, then they could create the future that they wanted for themselves and their children. And I think Chris mentioned they call me the forest maker, or some people do, and other people joke about being a tree whisperer. Don't believe a word of it. 95% of my time is spent re-greening mindscapes. And if I win that battle, because everything else that you need for restoration is literally in the landscape, if I win that battle, the rest is relatively easy. So the technique that was developed is called farmer managed natural regeneration, for better or for worse. It's a long, awkward name, but it's actually exactly what it says it is. It's not Tony managed, it's not World Vision managed, it's farmer managed. And that's one of the keys to its success. Why is it spread? The farmers themselves, the communities themselves own this process. They do it because they want to, and they know they will benefit. What's it involve? Again, it's actually not very earth-shattering. It's very, very simple. And it's not even a new idea. It's a traditional practice across much of Africa and even other parts of the world, which for one reason or another, people have gotten out of the habit of practicing. And so what's it involve? As I mentioned, these tree stumps are scattered throughout the landscape, or at the very least, even in the absence of tree stumps, at the very least, often there are seeds latent in the soil. And so we select the ones that we want to regenerate. When you cut a tree, and you can see that bottom left photo there are many, many stems coming up from the stump. It's too much competition, holding it back. So we reduce the competition, cutting back to maybe a maximum of 5 stems. We prune some of the side branches, and then from time to time we come back because little suckers, little side branches will regrow, and we clean them up again. And that's like releasing a spring, and the tree can begin to reach its potential. So in 1983, we started with about 12 volunteers in as many villages, and the system was working. I was encouraged. I knew that this could work at scale. But those 12 brave volunteers were ridiculed, they were abused, they were laughed at. And to add injury to insult, often their trees were stolen, maybe out of desperate need, maybe out of greed, sometimes just for fear of, oh, we can't break with tradition. Our forefathers told us to be clean farmers. And the whole project could have failed in 1983, but then events beyond my control took charge. And there was terrible drought. Barely any crops grew that year. And in 1984, the drought was followed by famine. And I'll read again. When I was a boy, reading about hunger or viewing it on TV left an intense emotional burden on me. But since I didn't have a personal connection, it all seemed remote. By 1984, I had been living in Niger for nearly 3 years. I'd made good friends. I'd received their hospitality, slept in their huts, talked late into the night around a kerosene lantern, eaten their food. I knew their children, their joys and their sorrows. When they came to Maradi, they stayed at our home and we reciprocated their hospitality. I had come to love and respect the people. Now my friends were hungry. This was the defining moment of my life. What was I to do? I didn't have any experience in famine relief. I could crumble and say there was nothing I could do about it, or I could at least attempt to obtain help and provide relief, as daunting as that was. So things began to get very serious, and people started camping around our house, desperately wanting the mission to help with food. And I remember one particular day, and our son, Ben, who's in the audience, Ben was about 3 years old, and I was literally pushing to get through to the crowd. I couldn't help people by arguing with them. I didn't have any grain. I needed to get to the car so that I could go talk to authorities, talk to donors, and get on with it. And I couldn't get through the crowd. And then I heard this voice from behind me, didn't you hear? Dad said he hasn't got any grain. Let him get through. And the crowd parted. It was just amazing. But things were very serious. Grain had disappeared from all the regular marketplaces in town. We didn't have any funding. And perhaps worse of all, as expatriates in a foreign country, we didn't have official authorization to give grain anyway. And I distinctly remember one morning, I was trying to eat breakfast and a lump was forming in my throat because these were my friends. They were suffering and I was unable to help. Tears were starting to form and my eyes fell on the open Bible. And the passage said, "Fear not and be not dismayed by this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, but God's." And immediately, I didn't know what, I didn't know how, but I had this great peace. I knew that God was going to do something very dramatic. Within 2 weeks, that authority that was blocking permission passed away. And we spoke to the mayor of the city who was interim in his position. Almost immediately, he granted permission. And I was talking to a colleague about this and just expressing amazement at how quickly we got that permission. And the guy said, "You got to be kidding." He was probably scared you'd pray for him too. Well, I certainly didn't pray for that. I prayed for a transfer for him, but he got a little bit, a big transfer. Within 6 months, we received $500,000 from around the world. We were able to purchase around 1,800 tons of grain and help about 35,000 people. And in Africa, nobody eats alone. It probably helped double that number. But the important thing was, in terms of the FM&R story, that was the turning point. We were able to use food as a tool to bring the best possible outcome out of a tragedy. Many people suffered terribly. Yes, we'll feed them, but how can we bring good from bad? And we orchestrated a food for work program, and people were required to regenerate trees on their land. Over the following 20 years, average tree density in Niger across 5 million hectares increased from less than 4 trees per hectare to over 40, 200 million trees without planting a single one. And I hasten to add, I definitely played a role, but there are other players. I mentioned this is a historical and also an intuitive practice. So there were other things happening in Niger at that time, but overall the impact was just tremendous. 200 million trees over a 20-year period. It was the start of a revolution that continues to this day, spreading to other countries. I've had the privilege of getting back to Niger a number of times. I think this shot might have actually been with Volker. And so it would have been 2019. And the remarkable thing that strikes me is what had been a downward spiral of degradation, poverty, and despair has become an upward spiral in those communities that have embraced this, an upward spiral of restoration, relative prosperity, and hope. And it's just thrilling. As much as I enjoy seeing the trees, it's this restoration of hope that's very, very tangible. In the book, I've tried to express that I'm not a one-man show. I didn't do this alone. The true heroes of the story are the millions of smallholder farmers who went against tradition. They embraced FM&R and they shared their knowledge freely with their neighbors and even with strangers. So I mentioned this, the power of FM&R is that it's farmer managed, not Tony managed. Secondly, there's hundreds of colleagues, both when I was serving in mission and today in World Vision, hundreds of field staff around the world who've really embraced this. Often they live in remote areas, sometimes separated from family. Sometimes they're threatened physically because people don't like change. And they navigate that and they serve willingly and happily to try and bring about good. And then there are dozens and dozens of individuals, international warriors, I call them, who advocate and talk to donors and governments and academics, and they create new programs in other parts of the world to try and bring about meaningful change. My biggest regret in the book is I couldn't give each one of them the justice that they all deserve. So Liz and I returned to Australia in 1999, and that's when I joined World Vision. And World Vision works in 100 countries approximately around the world. So for the first time, this gave me an international platform to introduce FM&R to. Every country in the world, to one degree or another, is impacted by deforestation and certainly by climate change. And to the degree that we're a child-focused organization, we have to be concerned with these things too if we really love children. So through World Vision, we've been able to introduce it to 27 countries, but we've influenced many other organizations and individuals as well to promote FM&R independently. I don't hold on to this. There's no patent on this. If you want it, please take it. We're giving it away for free. Where FM&R has been embraced, we see greater resilience to climatic shocks, increased rehydration of the landscape, more food, more water, greater biodiversity, increased opportunities for the people making a living off that land. I call this a no regrets technology. There's no real downside to it. Nobody's ever grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and said, Tony, you ruined my farm, you ruined my livelihood. Only blessing, only thankfulness. The Forest Underground is also a book calling for action. It's a call to action. And I believe that we're at a critical point in history, and there's actually very little time to act. At the same time, there's this amazing opportunity. By one estimate, there's at least 1 billion hectares of degraded forest land that could be restored. And in addition, more than 2 billion hectares of degraded farmland and grazing land. And we're not talking about turning that land into dense forest. People still need to grow food. They still need to make a living. We're talking about agroforestry through which productive agricultural parklands are restored. So FM&R is a nature-based solution. It doesn't force landscapes to do or to be something that they're not meant to. And it's both a mitigation tool. So as the trees grow, it's drawing down excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And it's an adaptation tool, helping people to cope with inevitable climate changes, reducing temperatures, wind speeds, reducing the severity of floods or the impact of droughts. And there's so many stories about that that I could share, but Chris might cut me off. So if we're going to succeed at this, though, we need a radical departure from project mentality. Mere addition of another project and another project, mere addition will never cut it. It's far too slow. We need to create movements that spread organically and that are unencumbered by budgets and red tape and compliance needs. And just as in Niger, we need a global movement that simply spreads from farmer to farmer, from individual and community to community, with minimal and even no external driving force. And my last reading. While the impact of FM&R on the environment, livelihoods, and food security was both expected and self-evident, in West Africa, we noticed the emergence of something else that was just as, if not more significant. I found people who were weighed down, living in uncertainty and fear of the future, people who had felt like hopeless victims of climate change and poverty. Now they were, to a large degree, masters of their own futures, and in a way that did not require ongoing dependence on foreign aid, expertise, or goodwill. FMNR practitioners now had the power to address their own problems. And with this, something very powerful was emerging. We began to see that the implementation of FMNR resulted in the tangible restoration of hope. Through the practice of FMNR and all that is involved in mobilizing communities, communicating, planning, overcoming obstacles, working together towards a common goal, realizing benefits and seeing changes in one's difficult circumstances, hope emerged. And so, sure, as I have the opportunity to revisit some of these communities, I love seeing the restored trees, the regenerated landscapes, but the biggest change is intangible, the restoration of hope. And if you put yourself in a parent's shoes, what must it be like to not be able to feed your children properly, clothe them, send them to school? It's soul destroying. And then they realize, actually, everything that we need has been given to us. It's at our feet, literally. We can create the future that we want for ourselves and our children. How liberating, how energizing, how empowering. So, Chris, how did I go on time? Because I could read one more passage, but I don't want to stretch my luck too much.
Please do, Tony.
Okay, last reading from the very last page. Today, I reflect on that boy in gumboots who yearned to plant trees on a barren hill. Feeling powerless, he reached out to a God of love and compassion and power. I see an earnest teenager and then a restless young man with Liz by his side who took trusting but faltering steps and who found the faith to keep moving forward despite setbacks and disappointments. More significantly, my doubts faded with the experience of seeing God at work, the God who does care, who does answer prayer, who does use very ordinary people to do extraordinary things. He is a God who has replaced despair, brokenness, and tragedy with hope, and hope through, of all things, trees. The lowly tree, despised, taken for granted, and abused by humankind from the dawn of time, ignored by scientists seeking technological fixes to problems of their own making, scorned by governments and industry in their blind pursuit of progress and prosperity, cut at the roots by the very farmers whose livelihoods and well-being depend on them. What more fitting symbol of hope than the humble and unsung tree, which freely serves humanity in silence and forbearance and without fanfare? In the face of environmental destruction and injustice, my journey started with a child's prayer, asking God to use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. I believe God honored that prayer, and I'm in awe of how he has and is answering my prayer. I'm grateful for the people who believed in me, supported, encouraged, taught, and went before me. There's little room for doubt that God has indeed prepared in advance good things for us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Such an inspiring story, and one which in a time of climate change offers one way that we can make and have made significant progress in caring for people and the planet. It really is an inspiration for all of us, I think, to hear you speak. Now, I thought that at a normal book launch, you would normally be able to see the actual book, but of course you can't do that. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to give you a little taste of the book. It's not much, but it's a little. Now I'm just trying to work out where it is. So I think you can see now, that's the cover page with comments written by a couple of people, both of whom are actually with us tonight. But it's a beautiful book. Let me just skim through a couple of pages for you. There is Volker, filmmaking with Tony. As you can see, full color photos, and the sort of book that you would put on your coffee table, the sort of book you would give away as a present. Feel free to make any comments, Tony. So there you have it. That's the book we're talking about. Now, I think it's time that we moved on to a time of conversation. Sylvia, you asked the first question. I wonder if you would like to unmute yourself, and we'll hear from you verbally as well as in the chat, and you can ask your question. Go ahead.
Yes, as you all know, the Ukrainian war is going on very brutally, and Ukraine is one of the biggest supporters of crops for the whole world. And now we are, I'm working for World Vision as well, and now we are seeing a huge hunger crisis coming up. So the question is, would Africa be able to step up and support the whole world globally with crops?
So thank you, Sylvia, and lovely to see you. So Sylvia is speaking from Germany. Yes, you know, if you look at the average farm yield across Africa, they're still using very traditional methods. Very few people can afford or even have access to fertilizers, irrigation, or improved seed. And even before you get to those additional inputs, if you like, by simply working with nature, you can at least double the crop yield. You can certainly increase the diversity so that you're not only reliant on a single annual grain crop that's so vulnerable to drought and flood and pests. Once you increase diversity and you improve the microclimate, you can increase the number of different types of crops and animals you're growing. The trees themselves become a resource that people can earn income from. And if they have income, they can sell surplus grain as well. So there's an enormous potential to increase food production in Africa.
Thanks, Tony. There's a question from Jackie about whether you've got an FMNR representative in South Africa. And there's also a question from David Lewis asking you to tell us about the FMNR movements, and also how we can, as average punters, that sounds like an Australianism, as average punters, how can we support these movements? So I wonder if you can answer those questions, Tony.
Thank you. So, Jackie, I'm not aware of people doing FMNR in South Africa, but it's quite possible. And if you want to sign up to be that representative, you're more than welcome. But information is freely available on the web, fmnr.hub.au, fmnr.hub/au. So lots of information there. There's a manual, and there's a training course that people can do. David, I guess if you're a praying person, please pray. I believe God answers prayer. If you're a giving person, that same website has a donate button. And if you're a going person, there's certainly opportunities in different organizations to implement not just FMNR, but there's a general umbrella: regenerative agriculture, nature-based solutions. There's lots of opportunities to use your skills in that space.
How do you give donations? So you've answered that question. If you go to that link, I've posted the link.
Thank you.
Liz has posted the link too. So you can give donations via that link. Is that right, Tony?
That's correct. There's a donate button there.
Yep. And I think it's probably worth saying that royalties that go to you for this book, what's happening to them? You're buying a big, expensive house, aren't you?
No, I've dedicated any royalties to the FMNR movement. So anywhere where I see a need and a small assistance can make a difference, then I'll have greater freedom to be able to help there.
Let me tell you, if you do want to buy the book, let me give you that link.
So, Chris, I saw I saw one question pop up, and I always get this one, does anybody do it in Australia? And I would say yes, and the principles apply. Eucalyptus is probably one of the best trees for resprouting. They call it coppicing. And so the principles are there. And even if you take away the constraints, regular burning, continuous overgrazing, full fence-to-fence ploughing, if you take away the constraints, nature has a chance to begin to restore itself. The question in our context is it cost effective? So labor is very expensive, and perhaps the products that you might harvest from regenerated trees might not pay for that labor. But I would argue that there's a very strong case for doing this for fighting climate change, for environmental restoration. So the principles definitely work. Now, also, I've talked primarily about trees, but we could also apply those kinds of principles to restoring grasslands and shrubs and other types of vegetation.
Thanks, Tony. Volker's left us a note. I don't think he mentioned it, but he mentioned it to us beforehand. Volker had to leave early because he's off to yet another film screening where he will be promoting the film and FMNR. Simone asks a question about whether there's a way to lobby governments such as Sudan, where I think she's saying where they have underground aquifers to set up FMNR.
Oh, certainly. And it's not like governments resist this, especially in this day and age where they're also experiencing the impacts of climate change and certainly the impacts of deforestation. That if this topsoil gets blown away, people are hungry, governments have got a problem. So you've got an audience there, and with the right people approaching them, and I put some of the photos up, and we have a few very strong international advocates in the audience. Most definitely, and often you have a listening ear there.
When will the screening of the documentary occur in Australia? We're not sure, are we? Next year sometime?
So yeah, it's just a matter of getting the licensing agreements in place, and we're expecting it in 2023. David
and Rosalind ask if you could make a comment on the effect of recent militant Islam in Niger and the region.
So this was so devastating for me, having lived in Niger for 17 years and going freely any time of day or night and most places in the country, never fearing for my life. And the last visit we made, they wouldn't let us out without an armed escort. And so it makes it very, very difficult. Of course, the first thing is for the people themselves. People are losing their lives. People are losing their livelihoods. So for them foremost, but then if you think in terms of development, your mind will not be on building up things for the future if you're looking over your shoulder in case there's a bullet coming your way. So it's terrible. Now, the impact isn't equal right across the country, but it's certainly significant.
Thanks, Tony. Charles from WWF, could be World Wildlife Fund, I'm not sure, in Myanmar, asks, can you share a good example of of FMNR movement in a country?
So apart from the Niger case, if I took Uganda, for example, and we ran a series of workshops culminating in a conference, I think it was in 2013, and I was amazed. It was a Friday afternoon. We'd been at it for 2 days. People, often on weekends, they go to their home area in the country. Usually they're busting to get away. The delegates would not leave until they'd put the foundation for an FMNR national network together. They elected a president, secretary, treasurer, and just the bare minimum, the nuts and bolts of how they would proceed. And that network is working to this day, increasing in numbers, new organizations, indigenous and international organizations, freely sharing the information. And their objective is to spread FMNR across the nation. So I think that there's a number of reasons why FMNR lends itself to movements. It's low cost. Everything that you need is literally at your feet. And the impact is very rapid. You have very early benefits, a little bit of fuel wood in the first year, a little bit of windbreak from the strong winds that would have buried your crop, certain wild fruits and fodder for the livestock. So even very, very poor farmers can do this. And as I mentioned, no regrets. There's minimal. I don't know of any unsolvable risk in doing this. So these types of movements are possible in most contexts.
Tony, that brings us to Jane's question. What are the biggest obstacles that you face in convincing farmers to adopt FMNR? For example, she says fear of trees taking over sunlight, water from the crops. And how do you convince farmers otherwise?
Yeah, I get that one all the time. And it involves conversation, and we talk about, so what was the environment like when you were a child? And usually people just, they're overflowing with description of the streams were constant, the rain was dependable, the soil was fertile, there were wild animals, firewood available, and so on. What's the environment like today? Oh, Mr. Tony, it's terrible. We can't rely on the rainfall anymore. The soil's so infertile, it's not producing enough food for us to eat. The women are walking for 4 hours to get fuel wood, and so on and so forth. And then I really twist the knife. If we continue business as usual, destroying the environment, what will life be like for your children? Most people that I work with may not have been to school, but they're very intelligent people, and they know full well things are going to get worse. And in Ghana, that last photo came from Ghana, they were at the point of leaving their ancestral land, their inheritance, to go to the capital city. They couldn't cope there anymore. They certainly didn't want it to get any worse. And then, fortunately, these days, we have the example of Niger and other success stories. And you can ask the question, well, do you think they were more intelligent than you? Did they have more money? Is their environment more reliable than yours? And of course, the answer is no. Then do you think we could go on this journey together and experiment? Will it work here as well? And we go from there.
Thanks, Tony. Look, I'm just overwhelmed, really, at what we can do with Zoom. Here we are, coming from all places, all over the world, meeting together to talk about this. I've asked Jimmy, who's asked a question in the chat. I've asked him to unmute himself and ask the question. Jimmy, please go ahead.
So I hope you can hear me clearly because of the bandwidth. So this is Jimmy, Tony. Good to meet you again after some times, Indonesia. So yeah, I basically, Wolf Vision Solomon Island is look forward to welcome Tony, especially to to use the methodology of FMNR to deal with climate change, such as
sorry, Jimmy. You said the Solomon Islands, yes?
Correct. Yes, Solomon Island. Correct. I am from Indonesia. I met Tony in Indonesia before, but I'm currently in Solomon Island working for Wolf Vision Solomon Island. So what I want to say is that we are planning, we are waiting to welcome Tony to come to Solomon Island to help us to work also using the FMNR, methodology to deal with this climate change, especially, to help us on some project with mangrove farmer degeneration. So thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jimmy.
So,
okay, yes, Ruth has a question. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, so that's a good one, Ruth. And again, it's this misconception that I'm growing trees that are permanent fixtures in the landscape. Nobody dares touch them. That's not the case at all. In most cases, of course, there's some areas where people are getting carbon credits, and for the bulk of the trees are left. But in the case of desperately poor farmers who don't have gas or electricity, this is their fuel source. And fortunately, the process of thinning and pruning and selective cutting, you don't have to destroy the whole tree. You have your cake and you eat it. So I think if we were to prohibit people from touching those trees, there'd be no story to share with you today. People are actively benefiting from sustainably managing the trees on their landscape. And that's very, very different to the bulldozer approach where we take everything today before somebody else takes it.
Thanks, Tony. We have a question from somebody called Liz Rinaudo. She thinks you ought to tell us about the online FMNR course.
Okay, so this is, I think the details, you'll find the details on that FMNR Hub website. It's a 6-week, I think it's 12 weeks course, requires about 2 hours per week. So it's not excessive. People still continue with their day jobs. It's facilitated, and people work together on solving problems. There's literature to read, problems that are given. And what else can I say about it? We found it to be extremely successful when some people in our team floated the idea, let's go online with this. I didn't say it, but inside I was just laughing. So how can you teach this online? This is hands-on stuff. You have to be in the field and holding the knife. But I let them develop the course, and it's been extremely powerful. So far, we've probably had more than 200 people do the course from over 23 countries. And not only do they become proficient in FMNR, the principles that are embedded in the course are excellent development principles. That question earlier, how do you get people to change? What do you do about blockages and threats and all this sort of thing? It's embedded in the course, so it's very, very practical. But I'm sure the details will be on that website.
Thank you.
It's Dennis Garrity here. I wonder if I might jump in for a moment.
Please do, Dennis.
Yes, Tony, you and I have worked together for many, many years, and I've seen the transformations not only in Niger, but all across the Sahel, and now in Eastern and Southern Africa, and then India and many other parts of the world. This truly is developing into a global movement. And as you related the inspiring story that you had shared with us from your book today, I had a thought and a question that I've never discussed with you before. And that is, why in the world are the wealthy philanthropists who are throwing billions of dollars into programs of various natures related to the environment, why are these folks not throwing money at our efforts in farmer-managed natural regeneration? It's a mystery. It's a real mystery when you have what is truly touted as the most effective, impactful transformation in the environment that we've ever seen in Africa, not receiving the support of the wealthier people who are concerned about the environment, and they are investing billions of dollars. Why is it that we have not been able to capture more of those resources to be able to support the community-led programs that could be, a huge step towards making that global movement that you described? Tony, what's your thought?
Thanks, Dennis. And I'm going to call you out now. Dennis is one of these international champions that I mentioned without naming before, and done the most incredible job in creating awareness on an international platform. And much, much more than that too, Dennis. It's a mystery. And as you were speaking, I thought, well, the farmers had to go through a mindset change. I had to go through a mindset change, and perhaps it's the same for these donors. And maybe we're misdirecting our efforts. Maybe we should be putting them all in an airplane and shipping them out there to have firsthand view of the impact that it makes. Volker, I don't know if he's still with us, but one of the drivers behind him creating the documentary, first of all, he's skeptical. If it was so good, it would be known. And then when he realized, no, it is good, but it's not known, that's what drove him. And he was 80 at the time, 80 years old. That's what drove him to make this documentary. And seeing is believing, Dennis. Maybe we need to just herd them up, put them in a plane and get them out there.
And the
Well,
ones that cannot get out there, let's send them a copy of the book. You know, the Jeff Bezos of the world, who has just put $10 billion on the table. The wife of Jeff, the former wife of Jeff Bezos, who's just invested $1 billion in various environmental programs. We need to figure out how to unlock that. And that's, I think, our next challenge.
Yeah. And sometimes when I think about it, our mindset in the West, at least, we think complex, difficult, long-standing problems like climate change must require expensive, complex solutions, technological solutions. And here's this thing, I do it with a knife. It's simple. It regenerates indigenous trees, which are undervalued. It's farmer driven, it doesn't come out of the lab. And it's bottom up, it's not top down. So there's certain things about FM&R that drives its success that seems to blind the people who could really fund something momentous.
Thank you, Tony. Dennis, thank you for saying that. ISCAST will be happy to send copies of the book, even to people who are billionaires. Let me take this opportunity to enlist all of you people. If you know somebody who should receive a copy of this book with a letter from you or a letter from Tony, we will happily organize it and send it to them anywhere in the world. We even have supporters who are generously giving money to get these books into people's hands. So please let us enlist you people. Tell us who should be receiving these books. Perhaps they're people who can make changes themselves. Perhaps they're people who will review the book. Perhaps they're people who will sell the book on to others. I'm sorry, but we will need to wind up. It's not a pleasant thing when you go to a meeting and and the meeting just keeps on going and you don't want to leave, but on the other hand, you had other plans. So I think it's only fair to wind up the meeting tonight. We may go on talking for a few minutes afterwards, but let me sort of officially close the meeting. Before we close the meeting, let me encourage you to do two things. I've sort of already done that. Firstly, please do buy the book. Buy many copies. They'll make great presents and they'll contribute to a cause that really is worth fighting for. As I said, ISCAST is a not-for-profit organisation. It's not that ISCAST plans to make millions of dollars out of this book, and perhaps for that reason the book can be sold at a price that it mightn't be sold at if a big publisher were publishing it. Secondly, will you spread the word about this book and FM&R? Well, we've been talking about that, haven't we? One way that you might do, which we haven't mentioned tonight, you might write an online review recommending the book. And you can do that on many book sites, for example, such as Amazon or Goodreads. Now, without further ado, and without a bottle of champagne to break over it, I hereby declare that the Forest Underground, Hope for a Planet in Crisis, is officially launched. Thank you again so much for joining us from all parts of the world today for this launch, and may the God of all creation give you peace. Good night.
Good night, and thank you so much.
Good night.
I'm thrilled. Thank you.